Thank you very much for that introduction. Firstly, acknowledgements to the Gadigal and Eora people on the land on which we meet tonight. Also, thank you to all of you for coming tonight, and also to the students that I missed seeing about an hour ago while I was preparing for this. So I'll catch you in the morning. The talk tonight's Finding Country, and I'm going to explain this work. It's what I've been on for the last 7 or 8 years doing. I'm going to show it to you in 3 parts. So one's Finding Country as a project about the city and about country. The next one's Finding Country as an architectural exercise. And the third's Finding Country as a dreaming that's still going on. So the first, Finding Country as a project. This is where I'm coming from. Australia is a continent with many countries. Another interpretation is that Australia is one continent and one country. This is how I see it. It's how Dylan, Michael, Conrad, Shane, this is how we see this country. When we're in another place, that's where we are, and that's the country we acknowledge. Back in 2006, I did a Masters of Philosophy at the University of Queensland and completed that after a couple of years. And the main idea that came out of that was bound to these 4 images. And it was about, I guess, a spatial idea. We'd been concerned up until that point in our work with Aboriginality as something to do with identity, which inevitably became a discussion around symbols and what things looked like. Trained as an architect, we still have to get back to what the spatial consideration is, and this is where it first kind of started to take more hold. So the image in the top left is in front of my grandmother's place, in front of my auntie's place, beside my grandmother's place, and it's these sort of spaces that we collect in front of and look out to sea around a fire, cooking meat or fish or whatever it is. But it's where the first understanding of space occurs. It's the distance between you and the next person, and it's the prospect out onto the ocean. And that's the first beginnings of talking and understanding your lineage and where you belong. First space. So the second space is the one on the right, and it's this is when it develops more, and the story and the narrative around how the land came to be is explained. So in this instance, out in the Murray, or in Mur out in the east, a dugong, an ancestral dugong, came across the waters from the west, laid up, spat 2 seeds out of its nose, and these 2 islands came. And the one on the right is called Dawa, which is where my grandmother's people are from. And that became its story of understanding. So I was saying to the students the other day, the scientific reasoning of this is that there was 3 volcanoes, but it's not as nice a story to tell. That's the second space. The third space is the one that we assemble as architects. And what became clear to me was that thing comes after the first 2, that once you know your relationship with your people and your relationship with country, then you can develop an architecture that's bound to that. The last diagram is my attempt to explain the space-time relationship. And the way I was taught at the University of Queensland was that all architecture could be experienced through one or the other, or a combination of both. And I think the way for us, certainly up where we're from, is that the space and time are the one and the same thing, and it can't really be explained as a sort of a literal start here, end over here kind of ongoing thing. For me, the idea was that spatially you were inside a section, you're in between land, sea and sky when you're alive, and when you come to pass away, you go into the place of your ancestors beyond those forms, and then you're reborn back into it. So you're in this continual state of just being in the moment. This is a small foreword. It's just my attempt to give you a definition of what country means to me. I was asked to write this as a beginning to a friend's exhibition a couple of years ago, but it's in the last paragraph that I think I've defined my understanding of country. Country is an Aboriginal idea. It's an idea that binds groupings of Aboriginal people to the place of their ancestors past, current and future. It understands that every moment of the land, sea and sky, its particles, its prospects and its prompts enable life. It is revealed over time by camping in it and guides my way into architecture. There is no disenfranchisement, no censorship and no ownership. Country is a belief, and that's mine. So this is the idea of what I'm trying to say is that before we get into the architecture, it first has to be about a notion of the city. And the studio we did when I finished at the University of Queensland was concerned with the city being made up as a series of layers, as a sort of sedimentary thing with a natural world at the base, an Aboriginal one above that, and on and upwards you went till you got to the final European and modern layers. Something in that doesn't quite ring true for me, because it just seemed to sort of say the Aboriginal place had gone. It was there, but now it's been rubbed out. And it's just not true. I mean, we've done enough work with Dylan over the years and travelled around enough places to realise the culture's there, the country is still there, and people who understand it still believe in it. And the way I thought about it was that it's no longer a matter of a vertical representation, it's just a horizontal one. So finding country is just about the contest between city and country. That's it. It's two football teams on a field, and it's one or the other forming the other. So if you look at it in those terms, city, or the idea of a city, is that it's all-encompassing. It's multiple titles that rub out any use of country and the way it might be managed. And if you take the likes of Bill Gammage on board, and the way fire is argued was of use as a mechanism, as a tool of country, then how could you possibly run downtown and light a fire without getting arrested? So where this is coming from right now, its current incarnation is about how do we burn out the city, theoretically, to reveal country and get some balance back into the environment. This took its final form last year in Venice at the Architecture Biennale. Interestingly enough, the theme was Common Ground, and it was set by David Chipperfield from Britain. And at the end of 2011, I spoke at an arts forum in Brisbane at Goma, and we had Paul Keating, the Prime Minister, was sort of overseeing proceedings of sorts. So I got to get the courage up and announce that I'm going to do this exhibition in Venice. I have no idea how I'm going to pay for it, but that was enough. And Keating, in his usual kind of graceful way, told me I was an idiot, but just do it anyway. So this, after the kind of excitement of saying it wore off, then the reality started to set in. And I realised I had to raise a lot of money to make this thing happen. And I was going to do it independently and as a sort of skirmish project if necessary. What we did was start to figure out how to do that. So as an architect, I'm used to spending money, not sort of making it for people to spend. We started early in that January of last year on the away program on ABC, and at that point we had zero in the account. And after speaking, this letter turned up out of the blue, and it's from a lady called Eve, and she effectively says, didn't quite get what you were talking about, but it sounded good, and here's $50 to throw into the kitty. So we stuck that on the wall, and we thought, well, if we can get $50 from someone we couldn't totally convince, we're probably going to get more if we can convince someone. So our first event started with this art auction, and I had the likes of Richard Bell, Vernon Arkey, Fiona Foley, Judy Watson and Gordon Hookey contribute all this work, and in one night we managed to raise $15,000, and that was it. We were off and running, and it was a fantastic thing. The former Lord Mayor, Sally Ann Atkinson, became our patron and inevitably became quite an important person in that whole scheme. As an aside, there's a lot of ways to get to the Venice Biennale and put something on, and I don't believe the Australian Institute of Architects is the only filter to go through. That represents a commercial interest as far as I'm concerned. There's other ways to do it. You can do it independently as a collateral event, and okay, you do need to raise about 100,000, but the minute that becomes something shared around 2 or 3 institutions, you can start to see how it can become possible. But I'm happy to talk to anyone about that at another point and what it means. But the thing to understand is that if you do it, you have to be good at fundraising, understanding what registration means, and that means $25,000. Media, how to produce something, how to install it, and how to explain it. So in this endeavour of last year, we arrived at a series of drawings that were based on giving 50 people a piece of the grid and asking them to empty it by 50%. And the idea was to say, right, if you empty it by 50%, you inevitably release country, and we start to find some symbiosis with city. Or some kind of conflict with cities. So that was the intent. People were briefed for 1 hour. We saw the drawings another 4 months later, and that was what we came out with. So some of it was really good, some of it was really ordinary, but we promised to put everything up so we got the whole spectrum. The graphic, which I'll explain later on as well, this final graphic was this idea of an Xray and the idea that you look into something, and that's where the aesthetic of it came from. So as the thing became assembled, you start to see on the right that it was a collection of a number of versions or comments on country and city. Some of them more utopian than others, which kind of missed the point, but nonetheless important because it was a real good health check on where people were at in terms of understanding what they thought country was. Several contributors understood that fire was a way to manage country, and that if you emptied it out, you would then set up a firing pattern to control these things. The drawing itself ended up being just under 8 by 3 metres, so it's quite a large thing, and we stretched it over 6 canvases, which we had to build once we got to Venice. And what I found is we worked with a group called Spiazzi, who are a local Venetian art workers alliance, and pretty hardcore Marxists is probably the best way to describe them. And they had a space right beside the Arsenale gate, and were fantastic to work with. One of the things I found when I was working with them is that things get lost in translation, and numbers didn't quite translate properly. Dimensions, widths, heights were just slightly shorter and lower than we were led to believe when we got there. The other thing I was led to believe was that timber would be there so we could frame this thing on the first day. So there was no timber, but they managed to resource some from the nearby British pavilion, which was, I was assured it was all above board. So in the way that we got this drawing finally framed up a day before we were about to open for the vernissage, that's when we realised the drawing itself didn't quite fit. And we had to get the thing in, turn it, twist it, get a hammer, knock it in this 15th century building. And that ceiling that you see now is straight used to have a big bow in it that came down about that much. So the thing just wedged itself up, and we didn't have to fix anything. It was just jammed in there. And one of those beautiful accidents was that up on the left, the drawing, because it was now at this angle, you could actually read it, and it was sort of obvious once we finished it that that's how it should have been to begin with. And it had this very nice kind of spatial setting in the exhibition, so we got away with something. The other thing that I've done in developing this, which I'll also show later, is as we've done a main work, we've also done minor studies to help pull out what the idea is of the main work. And in this case, it was 5 photographs where myself and 2 others went around some sites in Brisbane and projected moments of Aboriginal occupation or history onto a building that just totally ignored it. So, for example, the windmill on top of Spring Hill, which was used for a number of things, but also to hang some of the local people. We put these images up. There was another one where we shot an image from the Mississippi lynchings and put that up at peak hour, and it stopped traffic. So they're quite powerful images when you see it as it would have occurred on that place. The one in the middle was an interesting one around the architects of Goma saying that this building had a relationship with that same windmill and what had happened in that history of the local people. But it seemed to me there was a much more obvious connection right in front of them and what the building was sitting on, and that was this place that people used to collect to fish and eat and be together. The third image is even more interesting. It's just a local Queenslander, which is I guess the house everyone knows about in Queensland, but a lot of those timbers were sourced from first growth forests, and a lot of different groups of people used to bury old people in those when they passed. A lot of these timbers got cut down, milled and turned into houses, and there's always been this thing in my mind that people are literally not in the house itself but in the structure of the house, which has always in some cases given me the spooks, and in other times it's made me feel reasonably calm. The last thing, which I think is always important, is to leave space for people to object, say what they want to say, support it, get anything off their chest, and it's the sign to me of what a democracy should be about, and it's the sign of what a culture should be about, supporting difference and the voice that needs to say something differently. So if you want to know a bit more about that and where it's at, there's a catalogue and an online access to that. One of the things Shane mentioned just before is that there was a protocol around how I intended to acknowledge where we were in Venice, and part of it got lost again in translation. The understanding was that I would do an acknowledgement of the Venetian country, and they would welcome me, and someone was about to welcome me in the old Venetian language. So about 10 minutes before we started, this barge turns up, that you can see on the left, and there was a jazz band on it, and they sang for 3 hours, and they sang jazz songs just in Venetian language, and that was it. And at the end they said, would you like to say hello as well? So I did the hello, but it was kind of unusual. But because of the square and the locals and the Venetian and the whole thing, that it just made, I guess we'd made the move to acknowledge the people we were working with and where we're at. It just opened all these other doors, literally. The people around this area, this old Venetian neighbourhood, just took over this whole opening, and it was just the most fantastic thing, because as you know, the Biennale is a big circus for many different reasons, and this one was just a localised event, and it just felt accidental, but it was the loveliest thing I've ever been in. So it seemed at that point in time the reasonable thing to do was really jam home this idea of what country was, so I burnt the drawing. And the Venetians all got worried because I didn't realise there's a fire ban on the island, and you can get sent to jail and all this sort of stuff. But we started at one end and we burnt all the way across with a can of WD-40 and a lighter, and we came back the other way. And the nice symmetry about this is on the way out the door I told a story of when I was 10 and my uncle took me up to the islands there, and a particular island he took me camping on. I'd just come straight out of a private school, and he burnt the whole island, and I was terrified and I had no idea what he was doing. And he sort of explained to me later that he was just regenerating this island, but I thought he was a bit of a madman at the time. So we burnt away. The musicians made the necessary movement of things burnable, and that was our opening for the evening, and it was a beautiful thing. So that's when we finally got the Finding Country up there. It got the critical mass it was trying to get to. So I'm going to show you very quickly 4 projects that my practice has done since 2006, and all of it's bound to this bigger picture of what Finding Country is trying to do in relation to the city and country. So the first one's my own house in West End, just beside the city. And my wife, Susan, and I did this together, and we called it up until a few weeks ago the black and white house, because we tried to say it was just, again, about bringing these two opposites together and figuring out what the tension was and what that could be architecturally. So a lot of it's symbolic until we got into the detail and it made sense. So we realised the thing that was going to be the tension between the two was the light, and if we could use light in that way that we do as architects, then we could present something that's quite unique. The other aspect of it being literal is that in Susan being from Ireland and having a tradition of masonry, the house had to be half masonry, and mine being timber from the north, the other half had to be timber. So this thing became about how the two interacted the whole way around to provide a house for ourselves and our daughters. And Dylan's goddaughter. So the centre of this house, there's a hole, and one's open to the sky, because that's the first part of country, I believe, not underfoot, but what's above you. There's a second hole which has a roof on it, so that's its opposite. There's this compression that you see here. There's an artwork which is a motif from the Torres Strait, which used to get carved into skin and into arms and all sorts of things, amulets, which I thought would be less painful if I did it there, but I think I should have just got the tattoo. It was quite a tough thing. But it's the opposite artwork of this piece that Fiona Foley did in the middle, which is, they're all clear anodised Bodhi leaves, and the Bodhi leaf is off the Bodhi tree, and that's the tree under which Buddha found enlightenment. So she's on to that motif as something to open people's eyes up. So as the sun moves across this during the day, it hits those leaves and it just refracts the light across and around that polycarbonate drum. The function of that hole is as a table, and that's where I meet all my cousins and family and friends, and we sit out there, and it's just a comfortable place to sit. The difference between upstairs and downstairs is, again, in trying to reconcile opposites. The polycarbonate downstairs lets the light in as an extra, as I guess an act of extroversion. So the light's coming in from the garden. Upstairs, the only light that goes in upstairs is through that hole, so it's an act of introversion. So it's the exact opposite. And you can see that's that light box upstairs. It just pushes light everywhere. Anyway, you can see it if you come to Brisbane, give me a call, I'll show you. This one is in Lockout River, which is, if you get to Cairns and then you fly for about an hour and a half, almost 2 hours north, you'll get there. It's right up in the Cook. You can see Cooktown there, and it's right up. This is a great building. It was just it's just a local store and a set of government offices. And the usual way these things end up being is that they're Besser block bunkers, floodlit at night for security, and they contribute nothing architecturally. They contribute nothing to the community, and they just continue this kind of act of ghettoism. I don't know how else to describe it. They're just usually ugly responses. And we managed to get in front of the Department of Communities on this one, and they gave us a bit of space based on the work they'd seen Dylan and I doing down in Marama years ago, and it just gave them enough confidence to let us get on with something. And what it became about was not the shape, it was just about the space. And this space at the front was the most important thing. It was the series of concrete benches that allowed the local people to collect, meet, avoid each other, because they still practice avoidance behaviour, and manage the front door of this retail store, which had all the groceries and things. Now, the problem is that because there's these relationships that people have to avoid each other, they can't accidentally stumble across each other while they're in the shop. It's a really uncomfortable arrangement. So the idea that you have this place you can survey each other from before you enter and make sure it's clear and all this sort of stuff is quite an important thing. The original scheme that was being bandied around was to rip out all of these trees that were along the front, concrete it, and make the building as usual. And it's such a dumb move, because these beech almond trees that run along here are there's the obvious thing. In the tropics you need shade, and it's just as simple as that. It sounds banal, but it's incredible what lengths bureaucracies will go to take away the idea of maintenance. So we kept the trees, we made these seats under them so people could sit in the shade, they could manage their relationships. They got the first public space in any of the communities I've been to where it was actually around a civic idea. And it's this well-loved thing. The artwork on the top there was a way of managing the floodlight, or the floodlighting that occurs at night. And Uncle here gave us permission to use his artwork, and we made sure we got a payment and exchange to happen for that, and then it became this thing printed onto this polycarbonate panel. So at night when the floodlighting went on, which usually just blinds everyone, it became this sort of light piece or artwork that just glowed at night. So it's a beautiful setting, right? So, and it also meant people could sort of wait just to the edge of this light to use the government office spaces as well. Anyway, go to Lockout River and you can see it. This one's in Waterbender, and Waterbender is, it's just where it is there. It's just near Rockhampton. It's a couple of hours drive west on the way out to Emerald. And I usually take the Mount Morgan Road back in, Shane, so it's a nice one. I should have put up the drawing of the town. The towns are one of the classic grid arrangements that landed on just about every, didn't land on the communities, they landed and then people were forced into them in the storied history of these places. But those grids had no relationship with country, and they were just actions or mechanisms to control the arrangement of the people that were wrapped up in these places. So again, there's no civic spaces. There's nothing about culture at all in these things, and it's something I've encountered from day one of my architectural career. So the first thing I did was just to utterly reject it as a grid, and there's one place beside this town, which is where the cemetery is, beside a small pond. And I just turned the whole thing and generated it around this sense that it was facing towards that. And it didn't necessarily make sense in terms of all the ESD requirements that we're meant to observe, but we made it work because we addressed those. The left half of the building's an administration part for the school, and that was the original project. And the second half came on board because there was a fire. We picked up a library as part of that project. So it worked out to be the second fire project we got, but we haven't been investigated for it. So it was a great thing in that way that we managed to make 2 spaces this time round. There's actually 3. There's a court to the left. There's a waiting space that can only be inhabited in the afternoon, and there's one for the kids in that small auditorium in the middle. This thing we just put in the Institute Awards, which we don't usually have much to do with, but we've decided to put all our stuff in this year, and this thing just got a regional commendation for Central Queensland. So it's a nice thing, and even the detailing, the usual detail is that we have crim-safe, not on glass but over 8mm acrylic, and they're quite hard detailing to manage hard environments, and things get ugly really quick. So we turn the crim-safe detail into just a complete skin and just wrap the whole thing. So you can find ways to manage things and yield something. All the concrete was tilt concrete, so we poured it on site and used the roof sheeting as the form and pushed it up. So the image on the left is, I guess, that space. Everything's clad internally just with plywood, and there's 3 layers of insulation between it and the outside skin, which is what we use on all our projects. So we have 2 radiant barriers and 1 thermal barrier internally. So the 2 radiants keep that Queensland sun out, and the thermal one internally keeps the minimal heat that we generate in winter in. So there's a science to that. But the plywood was just the basic material we could get our hands on and get it out there, and the volume's generous, which it never is in these communities. So that's the thing on the left. The thing on the right is the guts of the library, and we just did a basic thing by introducing light through the middle of the plan, and it just changes the whole comfort of a place, just having due light. Because I can assure you these buildings usually that end up there are just, I mean, they're dungeons. There's nothing about them. This is the last of the 4, I believe. This one's just east of Brisbane City, near Tingalpa. It's a little school building that came out of the BER. And the geometry was just, it looks torturous, and it kind of is, but it was because of the Brisbane City Council and the way they'd set out the actual boundaries for where we could build on this site, and that is following its absolute perimeter. It's quite a tough building. It's all concrete. The one thing we did was use this metal screen that had to face west to shade the building, but use it to shunt light down into the aisles between the library stacks. This is still being fit out, but it's nice in the way that the whole thing ends up at the end of its journey in its plan with a triangular window, which is this thing about camping and the openings you get out of a tent. It's mirroring that idea, but it looks straight into the water body across the road. So it starts to edit out all the things that are ugly around this site and leaves you in this one moment with the wetland across the road. So it's a very ugly industrial estate around this thing, and it's blocked totally. So this last third is, I guess, the ongoing dream, if you like. So this is the thing that's taking its different forms. It's all these little projects and art things that I'm up to. And the way to understand it is that it's never ending. That's the first thing. And it's as much about a story as anything else. So the first story that I understood as being about us from the Straits was this thing about Tagai. And the story of Tagai is that he had 12 guys, and they were about to go on this big journey. And as he got to the canoe, 12 guys had eaten all the fruit and all the food, and he got very angry. So he knocked them off and strung them up and he threw 6 of them that way and 6 of them that way, and they became 2 constellations. And he set out, and in his hands, he has a spear, which is the Southern Cross, just there. In his other hand, there's a bit of red fruit, and that's it. And he set off, and that's his canoe. As that thing moves across the sky during the whole course of the year, there's different seasons that mark exactly where that constellation is. But it's the concept of that story which is interesting, that something will always come out of what is perceived to be a conflict or some kind of contest. So where this has all come from, the first original project was seeded in 2006 and 2008, and it was the original proposition to curate the Australian Pavilion. Now, we won that in 2008, and it was rejected subsequently a week later by Mr. Clark and on behalf of Mr. London, Lyon and Zarnes. That was a contest, and that's it, and we lost. But the contest was about how to represent Australia. Do we do it as a football field, like the Canberra Raiders, full of logos all over it? Or do we do it as an idea of patronage that has some kind of appropriate behaviour around it? And that's where we were positioning ourselves, and that's the argument we lost. But what we had planned originally was to do this project on 8 cities. And the first was based on this fantastic quote from Elizabeth Farrelly, and it said, "As you can see in our arts, fearlessly fostering political correctness in all its dreary forms. Let's not undersell ourselves here. Mediocrity is what we do best. It's how we know we're Australian." That became the concept and our opinion of what the Australian presence had been like at this cultural event up to date. It's our opinion. The second part just coincided with the Queen, who at the time was the patron for the Royal Australian Institute of Architects, and another great line, she believed the unique contribution of Indigenous Australia to the nation is better understood now than ever before. So it was our way in, I guess, of trying to present this idea of the contest between finding country or country and losing city, essentially. The process we're going to use was mapping, and everyone's familiar with what that means. But where we were going is that in order to understand what every city sat on, you had to go back into all sorts of drawings. The original surveys, for instance, in Brisbane, the general surveyor came up and gave instructions to the junior surveyors to record Aboriginal place names as close as possible. They're anglicised, but it's incredible how many of those names have just formed into gazetted suburb names, and you can see that history of the language there. On the right was an image from Achille Castiglione, an Italian designer, and he had this exhibition of glass plates, and that was to give an idea of the scale and size of what we're trying to do. 8 glass panels with 8 cities redesigned by 50%. And the action that we're bringing to bear on this endeavour was the idea of decline, and we're saying, like, when we did this in 2006 and 7 and 8, I mean, the globe was booming. People had money in their pockets. The idea that things would decline was just kind of dismissed as being nonsense. But in history, Babylon, Pompeii, Woomera, Chernobyl, New Orleans, Rome, Detroit, Mexico City, Christchurch even, Dublin. I mean, there's examples of cities that have emptied either because of politics, economics, war, natural disasters. So what if you could actually empty a city, not by those means, but by means where you gain something, and what we're trying to gain is country, right? And that's what this image on the right's about. We're trying to find something we've lost that is about Australia and its country. So plan was the form this thing would take. That's why it's in the big drawings. The aesthetic we would control as the directors of this project. So the first incarnation was actually looking at your car dashboard, and at night the colour of those instruments help you navigate through unseen space. So we're trying to adopt that as a way of becoming the legend of this big drawing. So if you imagine going into that into an exhibition space with 8 glass panels, quite dark, and then having this kind of lighting that just appears like you're in this nebula, it would be quite an impressive thing. And it's at an event such as Venice, or any kind of international event, you have to get that cultural and artistic thing absolutely correct. Otherwise, it just looks like it's half done. And that's where I think a lot of pavilions tended to fall short. The beautiful thing gets people there. That's not enough, but it gets them there. And then after that, you can then deal with the subversive messages and all that sort of stuff. So we were unsuccessful on those first two occasions. So we pressed ahead in 2009 and set up just a very low-key, low-budget, printed off my office photocopier drawing of Brisbane only. And we had 20 students help us do this, and a couple of more mature architects. And we had a go at this to see if we could do it. And what became really evident after doing this the first time is that we might have actually really dodged a bullet, because I don't think we were quite ready to get it right. In fact, the best we're at now is what I'm seeing in the last 2 days with the students here. What we gave each of the participants was a drawing on the left, which is purely contour, and you can see country under there. And this was still playing with that layered idea. It hadn't really developed into this contest between country and city. And you can see the city grid on the left. And then what came back was people emptying it, putting in what they believed was the way to sort of get this balance between city and country, and indicating what they thought were special places. Where they started to go off track a bit is that instead of just using the one technique of erasing, like if you had a pencil drawing and used a rubber, they started rubbing out fully and then redesigning a utopian thing, and that's what we're not trying to do, because that's as bad as the first move of rubbing it out as a city. So this was just slight erasure, it was cleaning up, and it was trying to show some important spaces. So this thing became assembled, and each drawing was its own small synthesis, if you like. So I arrived in Melbourne that morning with a box about this big. It's 300 or 400 sheets all printed out, and we started to set this thing up, and it was just an incredible experience at tiling, and how tilers, we should be much more generous with them, because it's a really difficult thing to line out this whole thing, and it took us 2 days, because we'd start, we'd get to the end and realise we're out by 100 mil, start again, put a chalk line, put a string line, and figure the thing out. But it was an incredible thing to actually achieve at the end and stand back and go, right, there's the drawing, right, we've got a lot of work to do, it's not quite there yet. So it was, in terms of it being a primer, it was a great thing to have done. So the side project, which is as much to do with my training at UQ than anything, is these skateboards. And my sole interest is in the presence of contradiction. That's what I'm interested in. And what these skateboards were about, we're trying to tease out this idea of ownership, that ownership can exist as a piece of paper, a title, and ownership can exist because you actually spatially fill something. So in the seats you're sitting, you own those seats because you sit in them, but the university has the piece of paper that says they actually own them properly. But they're not in contest. They actually can comfortably exist. These skateboards are decorated and painted with motifs that I kind of deduced from my place in the islands, and I sent them to 2 groups of pool skaters, a bunch in Los Angeles and a bunch down in Melbourne. And what they did is they break into abandoned schools, abandoned houses, clean up the pools, and then skate the pools. And they had to do that, send me the videos, send me the images, and most importantly, send me the board back. So what I had at the end were these artefacts, not of that kind of... these artefacts actually became a way of understanding that ownership could happen and exist in a contradictory way. When I was raising money for the show last year, I had to sell them, and I managed to get $500 for each board, which was good. So that became the next event on this dreaming pattern, and we took all the videos, and some of the skaters came up and we did this thing in Brisbane for one night, and it was just an incredible kind of event, because half the crowd were a bunch of manky skaters, and the other half were professional architects, and there was a free bar in the middle, and it had its own form of tension, which was interesting. Brings me to 2011, and on the back of those things, and on the back of any idea, other things tend to keep flowing from it. And QUT at the time offered me this opportunity to pull together a small set of speakers to look at this idea of funding country and what it might be about. So what I did is I picked 6 people, 3 Australians and 3 internationals, and the idea was to not talk about finding country, but to mirror it in the way that they did their work. So the first guy was Tom Dupuy from Ireland, who is one of my favourite architects in Ireland, and he looked at the relationship between architecture and culture, and his work is just incredible, but he spoke about that as it was deduced down into the way he builds and designs. So it became a code for what I'm trying to do. I'm saying, well, if he can use Irish culture as a way of making his buildings, I can use Aboriginal culture as a way of making mine. There's no difference. The second was Michael Markham, who is a mentor of mine and part-time collaborator, and he looked specifically at this thing of architecture and camping, and then it turned into this idea about occupation. And again, hearing it from someone who's not Aboriginal, in their own words, gives this another kind of reading and accessibility. Gina Levenspiel looked at architecture and misrepresentation, particularly in the media in Australia. None of our projects have we been able to get published in Architecture Australia over the last 10 years, so we haven't persisted, but we certainly made the offer to do it. But her research found some really interesting things, and it revealed that the journal itself isn't quite a journal, it's more a magazine that's succumbed to commercial interests. So the people who, and the practices that are most prolific in it, don't actually reflect in the way that the Bureau of Statistics have seen development in this country. So the states with the most building approvals have the least amount of representation of those things. And that can be explained in a number of ways, as simply as, well, there's not much architecture in Queensland, but the numbers are kind of overwhelming and they're kind of suspicious, I guess, and that's purely our opinion. In that kind of a setting, something like this, finding country that's actually not about making architecture but potentially threatening to take it away, is not a welcome initiative. The next one was David Stewart, who teaches at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and he effectively holds the keys to the Shinohara archive. And what was great about that was that he was able to show through Shinohara's work what a tradition can actually be synthesised into in terms of a new architecture, and that's the thing I'm most ambitious about, is trying to take what our culture is and making it into these incredibly technical and incredibly resolved buildings that are more than just about an identity crisis. Next guy was Eames Demetrius, who's the grandson of Charles and Ray Eames. He spoke about architecture and geography, and the way he did it is that he has a story, which is an arts project of his, goes around the globe telling a story of a parallel universe in which he places these little plaques. And we're about to go up to the Torres Strait and plant one in 2 weeks on my island, and you then get pinned into the story. But the map that he has of the globe is like the Aboriginal map of Australia, which is also like, the map of counties in the UK and Ireland. These things have a connection somewhere. But hearing someone tell the story about another place was just, it could open ears. So that was the relevance. The last one was Tim Hall, who's, I think, the best structural engineer in the country, and he spoke about architecture and structure, but specifically framing as an idea of origin. So he looked at the original structures in and around the Gippsland area and just deduced exactly how they went together as a concept, and he's used those ever since in the work that he's done. With basic ideas of efficiency in the material and working that through to the point that it does exactly what it needs to do. So he was so eloquent in the way he described it, and I'm not doing him justice at the moment. So that gets us to 2012, birding out the drawing, which I've spoken about. And that brings us to this year. And where we're at now is that it's in its next sort of layer of thought, and it's been brought about by two books. One is this, which is The Biggest Estate on Earth by Bill Gamage, where he's detailing the use of fire as a tool for managing country. And he also suggests that part of the book, if people from 1,000 years ago turned up today and saw what we consider to be wilderness, they wouldn't actually recognise it. And fire was used to germinate, to hunt, to manage land, and to leave a fire in an uncontrolled state. It was quite a costly mistake to make indeed. The other book, which I haven't put up, is this one by P.V. O'Reilly, which I've been waxing on the last 2 days about with the students. But he was in a show with Eisenman and Kipnis, and he's on this idea which is to do with archipelagos. And he was trained in Venice, and he is concerned with the difference between capital and labour, the individual and the collective. So there's obviously Marxist theory in that. But what he says about the archipelago is that if you imagine a building as an island that's surrounded by water, well, the building itself is a commercial action that's only concerned with itself at best. And then he says the water in between them, the water is actually the act of the collective, and that's the thing that forms that building. And I was speaking with Dylan that I think maybe therein it lies what the role of maybe the government architect's office is to do to recreate itself or reinvigorate itself. But that's just posturing. But it's interesting because what it's saying is that if you have an idea for the city, it will affect the form of these buildings or this architecture, but equally if you have a form, it can affect the collective as well, or the polis as he calls it. Point is they're bound to each other. And this starts to get to where we are as of last week. So a building I've been working on with Michael Markin in Albury for two fantastic patrons of architecture, has just been rejected from the Victorian and national awards for not being entered in the spirit of the awards, whatever that means. So that was Ross Clark and Richard Barton on behalf of the Victorian chapter and National Council. I would opinion that these guys are making it up as they go along, and they are disgraceful. And it would be very easy, after all this time, to paint them as racist. But I'm not going to do that because I think it's much more interesting to bind them in the way that story has, that they are just part of this thing and how it forms itself. They're the thing around this archipelago that helps form this project as it goes on. The piece of work that's of contention is this thing in the middle, and it's called Copal, which I did. And Copal means belly button in my grandmother's language, and the belly button represents the idea of origin, the origin of all things. And the origin of this thing is finding country. This thing came, the building was designed around it, and its origin is in that Tagai story, Back Beyond. It isn't this idea of contest, and it keeps going and going. So that's when it started, that's how it became, and this is where it's ending up now. So it will never overcome commercial interests, and I'm sure of that. But it is the right thing for cultural emancipation, so I'm going to continue on this trajectory. And that building, which I started the show on, and this is it, is without a doubt the most significant piece of architecture in this country. The last time I felt as dumb as an architect was when I went to Mercath's Boyd Centre at Bundanong, and I was a young architect then 10 years ago, and I thought this thing was the most incredible thing. It was, immaculately detailed, it was beautifully executed, and its sense of understanding of the country and its position in it was just, it's something that made me love the guy more, but also hate him at the same time because it just made me feel so stupid. Well, this thing is that plus 10. And it's a pity it's not going to be famous, but it's going to be rendered infamous. But the thing is, the building is, the clients are, and that's the story of finding country. Thanks. Sure. Sure.
We have a little time if you'd like to ask a question or make some comments.
This is, I have not yet formed a question, but I'd like to hear more about what you were saying at the end there. I feel very intrigued and I don't know quite how to ask. What else can you tell us about this?
Not much. Not much at the moment. I mean, that's the story of it. It's just, I'm starting to meet some of the most fantastic architects out there are the ones you never hear of. And these are the guys who just do the most exquisite thing, and they just get on with it. There's one guy here in the audience, Paul Folleris, and it's just, there's this stuff that happens that I just think is some of the most amazing work. And, sometimes you get up and sometimes you don't. But I think the important thing is to keep going with it. So I can't say too much more about this building because we're still under a form of negotiation, I guess. But we have had it kicked out of the awards, and I still have projects under consideration in Queensland. So at some point, everything has to collide. But I did promise to speak about it on By Design at the end of May, so maybe tune in then.
I'm very intrigued by your mapping exercises and projects. And so I have two questions. And the first is, do you leave the traces of the fire on the maps themselves?
Well, I did in Venice last year.
In Venice?
Yeah, absolutely did. Yeah.
And is it just a series, almost like a new set of coordinate lines, the fire? Or is it all over?
It's all over. So that's not all over. It's what we're only in the first, we're in the first application of using fire now because of what's happened last year. What I found last year and the year before was that people got really anxious about addressing the question of Aboriginality in country and really got tied up in it and couldn't quite handle it. So they kept going backwards in history and going, right, well, back then you guys used to be like this, so therefore I'm going to just reinstate something from back then. And it was missing the point that it's about now. Like, what if you could do something that just flushed out, at least theoretically, how you might bring these two things literally into competition? How would you do it? That's it. So the idea of this fire. Hey?
It's not an erasure.
Oh, sure it is. It is, yeah. It is. So the idea of saying, right, you guys have got fire, and I've been explaining it to the students the last few days, is that I don't want you to try and get your head around all things Aboriginal. All I'm going to give you is the fire. And by using that to burn this thing out, you're effectively using the tool of country. And that's as close as I can get you to country. Like, I can't make you Aboriginal, I can't give you a certificate, I can't do all these other things. But it just meant, that's what I was trying to get to as an end game, was that if country is legitimately reinstated in a city or taken out, it would have to be managed as country. And to me, fire, and certainly up our way, fire is the tool of managing that. So what we've got the kids, I shouldn't say kids, sorry, what we've got the students doing now is that they're coming up with incredible reasons for why they're burning in the way they're doing it. And that's where it's at, I think, because some of them, I mean, some people are doing some incredible things. What was the second question?
Sorry?
Was there a second?
Oh, it was perhaps a more design question, but whether or not, if it were ever possible to construct a three-dimensional version of the map that you have created, or that fire actually induces the third dimension to what is seen as a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional space.
Sure.
Right? So that I'm intrigued by the fire because it's not destructive in how you've rendered it, because it's allowing for a different map to appear, in a sense.
Yep. I can only answer the first part of that, and that's the three-dimensional is probably the next frontier for this. So maybe I'll come back in a year or two and I'll do this thing again. But I did see that show I mentioned, the Eisenman one, that was called the Piranesi Variations. And it's just incredible. They did this, and I realised how kind of, I was quite pleased with myself at the end of last year, and then in Venice, and then I saw their thing and went, geez, I'm undergraduate. You know, when you see what the Americans just did with this idea in 3 dimensions and as polished and as sophisticated as they did it. And it was the same thing, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but with all the, you know, pizzazz that only Eisenman could bring to something like that, I guess. But anyway.
I set my drawings with Peter Eisenman on fire as well, but for a very different reason.
Yeah.
With the building that you've got on the screen, which has the internal courtyard, is that the kind of tent flat window that you were talking about before, that triangle that you've got in the middle of that structure? Does it give you a vista through to the courtyard?
Yep.
Or from the courtyard out to is it a water?
Yeah, right behind that window is a fireplace. And the idea is, and Michael did this house, is that when you go to sleep beside the fireplace, you're looking up at the sky, and it's literally like being in a concrete tent. So it's this beautiful moment. And as you move around it, because the opening's bigger than the thing in front of you, as you move around it, you never quite see the edge of the perimeter of that opening. So it's always this sense that you're outside. But that geometry that you saw of the that window is just down behind here, and there's the fireplace. But this geometry, there's 5 diamonds that have a reflection in the past, and you only get it when you're standing here and you see the whole thing as a real thing, and then you see a thing as a reflection, and that's when it becomes the whole thing. This is just using local granite, and it was bush hammered in these parts and then polished in these parts.
I think for me, one very interesting thing, and it's not something I can articulate very clearly, but it's the kind of critical role of architecture. What is its critical role? And I think you've touched on some raw nerves in proposing something about, the proposal about how Australia presents itself at the Biennale, which didn't please certain people, and which went against certain accepted market or commercial or whatever aesthetic modes. And I'm sure the same kinds of things are part of the story of this particular building as well. But it's not a critique of architecture that's normally picked up. It's not militant in that sense. When architects critique, it's by some subtle formal device. It's not about undermining some of the key foundations of how the profession practices and how it sees itself and so on. So that side of it, I think, for me, is very, very interesting and worth a lot of discussion. And the fact that it's coming from an indigenous voice makes it doubly interesting for me because of that notion of a conscience, in a way, that the country has a conscience that sometimes wells up and asks difficult questions.
Well, the only way I can respond to that is to say, in our family we're connected to Eddie Marlowe, so there's a history of not doing things by halves, I guess. And the other is that I have Irish ancestry, and I'm a member of the German club.
As well.
Yeah. At the moment I'm studying sustainable architecture, and for me sustainability is about finding country and original thinking. Are you working with sustainable architects in your buildings, and how do you work it into your building?
Yeah. My idea of sustainability is 2 things. One is about our culture and sustaining that as a social thing. That to me is the most important thing. The second thing, my understanding of sustainability also comes from this idea that we should technically tune things up, not down. And by that I mean the most tuned constructions you'll ever come across at the moment are spaceships. The things that go to the moon are the most tuned things, and they are sustainable. There is not one thing that doesn't need to be on those bits of construction that don't need to be. And they manage temperature, they manage life, they manage air, they do all these things. So the reason that, I'm not saying I'm going to start designing spaceships to live in, but what we've been doing with our buildings is tuning and tuning and tuning and tuning to the point where now we've just got to the end of what you can do with a passive strategy. So all these little insulation techniques we've been tuning, we don't really talk about much, but they work fabulously. And the next thing, which is where this piece of work's at, is that it starts to go into that other area where it's sealing the entire environment and controlling it in that way, and using air exchange systems that were designed in Germany. So I mean, this thing is my ambition. That's where I'm heading. Like, I want these things to be so technically tuned that their embodied energy and what they use going forward is minimised to the point of to the point that it can be. I'm not there yet. But that's where I want to go.
As a follow-up to that, does that mean that you have some kind of how to put this, projected anticipation of the lifespan of this building being very great?
Yeah.
The embodied energy question is really about lifespan, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. You've just found the hole in the argument. Because on one side I'll say, right, I reckon you should build for 100 years. If it's a material with high embodied energy, I think you should build for 100 years so that thing makes sense over time. Something with low embodied energy, then I think it's something that should be built. So one's a permanent building, the other one should be permanent through its action of rebuilding, like the Shinto shrine. So that makes sense to me. So in that way, it's less about which one's which, but that there's a commitment to the permanence, either as an action or as a finished building, and that's where the equation gets set.
For your example, like the Xray or something, the Shinto shrine, it makes sense to me to think that the building and the surrounding forest that generates the timber that they cut to replace the building, in a sense the forest is part of the architecture, and so that intellectually linked with these things. And I can only imagine from the little I know that is part of the burning itself. It's about altering the system, but it still isn't contained within it. But so the toxic waste products are they are the soil that it comes from. So I always feel a bit conflicted about these buildings with their complicated and to some extent like ethically ignored production systems. So I'm not quite sure how you resolve this issue, or is it just one of the problems that we face?
I think that's the problem every architect faces. And I guess the way I'm addressing it is in that argument around permanence, whether you choose to do it as an action or as a complete building. This thing is just ahead of anything I've ever seen. And there's only two materials. It's concrete internally and fridge panel externally. That's it. And it's taken this. There's just no bits in it. It's just incredible. That's it. And that's going to stay there for 100 years. You know? And it just sits beautifully at 26 degrees without doing anything. But no, you're right. I mean, what you've articulated is and that's the next frontier, isn't it? So.
I was interested, I'm sort of intrigued by the motif that you were using in the building, and wondering if the fact that you're using a motif like that makes it have a different type of significance to you, or to the intent of the building and the intent of the motif. I guess it's making me compare it in some ways to Aboriginal art and the idea of stories and storylines and things like that. And do you think that maybe there's a difference in your architecture that makes it really quite unique with those sorts of stories going into it? Would that be an accurate description or something?
I don't really think about it like that, to be honest. But, I mean, I'll agree with you if you think so.
It just made me curious, like seeing the motifs, and then I guess also the dialogue of how it maybe isn't going down well with the standard of architecture in Australia. You know, maybe it's a different thing in some ways.
Oh yeah, I mean, Dylan will tell you I do my own thing. So I think the interesting thing about those sort of triangles is that, I mean, there was 20 drawings just scaling them up and down, trying to get the right scale that worked in that space. Because the thing about that space was that it was like a car park before, and we knew it was a car park because we'd modelled it. And then there was this thing where, like Col Madigan in the National Gallery of Australia, there's this beautiful thing about the ceiling that pulls these massive monumental spaces and gives it some kind of intimacy somehow. And I wasn't looking directly at it, but it certainly was somewhere in the background of my thoughts. And I mean, a triangle is like worldwide, I think. But in seeing it in, you know, all these old photos with old from the Cambridge expeditions and these old relatives with these things on them, the most beautiful kind of carving, and then these cousins of mine now doing artwork with that motif. It's sort of, it was an obvious starting point, I guess. But like I said, I should have just got the tattoo. I think.
All right, thank you very much for the talk and for
Okay.